How can sense making give us sovereignty? It's evident many of the pieces of the puzzle are moving rapidly right now. The political situation, economic, social, cultural landscape are all shifting rapidly with everything from the energy crisis, a new prime minister in the UK, developments in the Ukraine conflict, and of course, a new king. Meanwhile, it's incredibly evident that a number of the global agendas and narratives are advancing rapidly amongst the chaos of this world in transition. How then can we make sense of the complexity of all of this without becoming overwhelmed? That's the subject of this very brief session tonight, because it seems to me that more than ever before, it's essential that we develop our critical thinking and sense making faculties, because it can become almost overwhelming by the volume of shifts that are occurring right now. How do we make sense of those situations, not only to develop our awareness and understanding of what's really happening in the face of sensationalist media narratives, blatant manipulation, behavioral science, and algorithmic manipulation? How do we therefore ground ourselves in reality? How do we make sense of what's happening in the world? Sense making, as we discussed in last week's podcast episode with Alexander Beiner, is far more than simply critical thinking. It's about having awareness of how our senses are playing out. And during a sense of heightened stress or overwhelm like this, it can actually interfere with our ability to ask the cutting questions that are necessary about what's going on in the world. Now, sense making, as I've just very briefly outlined, is far more than critical thinking. The fact that we use all of our senses in perceiving the world and how our mind is always generalizing, distorting, and changing information as we absorb it through all of our senses. In order for us to really pick up on what's really happening, we must tune into our inner sense of consciousness and awareness as we're consuming information, to make sure that we're able to critically evaluate things without falling into any traps or falling for any manipulation or deliberate propaganda. And there is really an assault of all of these things right now across all dimensions. It's a 24/7 game across social media. The algorithm is constantly serving us information that confirms our biases or triggers us. Therefore, our state of mind, as we're examining the state of the world, can be hijacked in our pursuit of finding truth. So sense making itself is the act of making sense of an unknown or complex or uncertain environment using all of our senses beyond simply the cognitive side of the mind in our critical thinking. Yes, questioning everything is part of that process. But as we question everything, our footing can begin, we can lose our footing on solid ground, because, you know, the amount of people I've spoken to who have spent their life believing that politicians and the government simply have their interests at heart have become so disillusioned from what they've seen over the last few years that their trust has been lost not only in politicians and the government, but the institutions themselves. And this isn't just happening across government, it's happening across media, it's happening across education, it's happening across science. You know, and in these conditions, when trust is lost, it creates a very unstable footing, because people not only start to question the matter at hand, but they question literally everything. And trust begins to break down. And that's a very dangerous place to be. So the reason I've titled this brief rant, if you will, is how can sense making give us sovereignty? Well, there's a couple of things here. Firstly, it can help us to deepen our awareness of what's really going on and critically challenge the dominant narratives that shape our lives. And we have to realize that these narratives are designed in order to shape our lives. You know, advertisers learned this way back in the early 1900s. You know, advertising is a long-standing industry, but they really understood how to captivate people's attention, firstly, and influence how they see the world in order to determine how they feel, what they think, and what actions they'll take, and specifically in the form of advertising to make you make a certain purchasing decision. But the same tools can be used now to alter how we think politically. They can change how we vote, and they can change how we see the world, change how we feel, and therefore what we do or do not do, more importantly, in the context of what's happening in the world today, where there's a lot of issues whereby we're seeing, in the face of all these issues, perhaps it's overwhelm, but we could describe it as apathy. And in the face of this changing political environment, the changing world narratives, the shifting of these global agendas that are really coming at a pace now with real change knocking at our door when it comes to challenging Western culture, challenging our freedoms, challenging our liberties, challenging our human rights, taking this really paternalistic, greater good approach to how we manage society. All of this is happening at pace. It's like a bombardment right now. So sense making gives us the opportunity to slow down. He says to himself as he's going like a bullet train, to slow down and start to really perceive consciously what's happening in the world and start to open our mind to what the broader narratives could be and what's really happening, to understand the complexity. Because as we saw over the course of the pandemic, the government and the media really oversimplified the story of COVID-19 down to this very simple narrative of it's a respiratory virus that passes from person to person. And as a result, every story was based upon that, which created an enormous amount of fear. All of the complexity of the science, of virology, of how viruses transmit, of the different risk factors, all of the different variables were completely discounted. And it was simplified to this idea is that if you spend time with another human being, you may cause granny to die. And that oversimplification was used over and over again to create real hysteria over the last 2 years and ongoing. We're going into autumn now. Watch this space. However, the same is also true of those who are trying to make sense of the world. There's a very real risk that we oversimplify what's really happening when we look at the global agendas and we miss the nuances and the complexities and all of the things that underpin the trajectory that we've been on, the history that's led us to where we are today, the cultural factors, the social factors, the gradual erosion of institutions, the slow creep within education, all of these different factors that are playing a role today. When we oversimplify the story, we can miss the breadth, the width, and the depth of what's really happening in the world right now. So sense making gives us sovereignty on the basis that firstly, we can get a deeper understanding of what's happening in the world, but we can also get a sense of the complexity and the interrelating factors that are playing out today, including the global agendas. But if we oversimplify it, then we're making the same mistake that the government, that we're doing the same thing that the government did to us over the last couple of years. So getting sovereignty enables us to break out of that pattern and to see things as they are. And importantly, not to see things worse than they are, because what we tend to do when we've become overwhelmed and when there's all of this kind of chaos unfolding, we can start to shut down and panic. We talked about last week how, and we talked about it at the event on Tuesday in Bristol, the first Raise the Nation event, how at times like this, in times of economic uncertainty, political uncertainty, social uncertainty, cultural uncertainty, people tend to bury their head in the sand. I saw it firsthand during the first financial recession. I was working in financial services and I saw customer after customer, client after client, ignoring the economic factors. And by ignoring those economic shifts, many of them lost money, they went out of business, they lost their homes. And if they just paid attention with greater sense making to what was happening in the world and how they can navigate, importantly, how they can navigate the changing environment, they can make changes in their own life, in their own business that could have saved their businesses, that could have altered the outcome. Now, here I am 10 years on, seeing the same challenges, not only in terms of the economic shifts, but the political shifts, all of these things happen in a cycle. I'll talk more about cycles in the future, not as part of today, but today's session is a much deeper session. But being able to witness what's happening in the world enables us to anticipate what the road is potentially going to look like ahead. And by anticipating the future, we can properly prepare. And by properly preparing, we can course correct, we can take different action. And to me, sense making is not only about awareness and understanding. It really is, from the strategic point of view. And if you look at some of the prior definitions of sense making, it's our ability to be able to act in uncertain environments. Sense making enables us to be able to make sense of the terrain and take appropriate action. That to me is what sovereignty is all about. It's the ability to make sense of the world ourselves, and it's the ability to determine what course of action we will individually take, but also more broadly within groups, within cohorts, within collectives, within societies. Because let's be real, we talk a lot about the importance of individual freedom and liberties. I've spoken about that countlessly for the last 2 years. But the reality is, if we want things to change in the world around us, we have to work collectively. That means we're not talking about collectivism. We're talking about working in groups. We're talking about working in cohorts. We're talking about working in campaigns to actually affect change. Because ultimately the scope and the size of the challenges we're facing, not one of us can influence on our own. It requires us to come together to effect change. Many have been asking for that for the last 2 years. How do we unite? How do we unite the people? That's critical. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about collective power, collective action. It's necessary. But sovereignty occurs on an individual and collective basis. And sense making, the act of sense making, can help us make sense of the terrain that we're operating in and determine the most useful and productive and impactful courses of action that's available to us. But if we're stuck in overwhelm, we're stuck in crisis, we're stuck in conflict, we're fighting each other, then we're going to fail to do that. So sense making is a tool that helps us to ground ourselves and start to determine a way ahead. Now, it also gives us sovereignty on the basis that, historically, people have become so accustomed, so acclimatized to just turning to mainstream media to understand the world. The trust in newspapers, the printing press, back in the day of 4 channels, I'm 38 years old enough to remember 4 channels in the UK. Yes, some of the younger folk are like, what do you mean we haven't got thousands of channels? Yeah, there was a time we had just 4 channels. And there was a time before, I think I may even been alive when we just had 3 channels. I don't remember. I'd have to look back over the timeline of when Channel 4 was launched. But either way, people historically went to mainstream media, traditional press, to make sense of the world. And right now, there's obviously a huge information ecosystem. The way that we can discern the world. I mean, every week right now, I get a new email from someone in my inbox saying, check out our new Substack, check out our new Medium account, check out our new Twitter, join us on Instagram. We're getting bombarded with all these amazing information sources that could help us to get a more sovereign and alternative view on what's actually happening in the world. And it's not necessarily an alternative view, it's the view in many cases, but alternative to the major grand narratives that dominate our lives. But as such, we've got all of these sources. And, just last week, I was preparing for some content for this week, and I started listing out the sources that I was going to check out. And it just got overwhelming because, for those of you who follow the Pandemic podcast, I go deep, the amount of articles and resources that I've consumed in the last 2 years is insane. It's insane. We have to be able to perceive what's happening in the world with our own senses, with our own eye, with our own faculties. Yes, firsthand perception, but to actually understand the depth of any scientific matter, for instance, or any political matter, then it really helps to have access to quality resources that give different points of views and perspectives. But it becomes incredibly overwhelming when you've got such a vast ecosystem. And the traditional markers of credibility and trust, how do we truly, when we're looking at independent sources, alternative sources, how do we know how those can be trustworthy or credible? Ultimately, the same metrics of trust are no longer there. Now, the challenge is, in the modern world that we live in the social media world, is that popularity determines credibility. Now, let's just think about that for a minute. Let's just sense make that subject. Is it possible that someone who is popular has very little sense of what's really happening in the world? Is it possible that the popular people are the ones that we really want to drive the world forward? On what basis have they become popular? Now, popularity, of course, in the space of content, it is a marker of credibility, but ultimately it's not necessarily a marker of trust. We have to be able to sense make even around these new modern metrics of credibility. Popularity itself is not necessarily a measure of credibility. So we have all of these challenges. And as such, what happens is we can become, again, bombarded and overwhelmed. So to get sovereignty in our sense making, we have to learn how to navigate this ever-growing, ever-complex media ecosystem. And again, I can feel it, like even as I'm talking, I can sense how some of you are feeling right now. I think, well, how do we do that? It's so much. It really is. There is all this intensity out there. And it's a big question. But the good news is there are tools, there are practices, there are mindsets, there are resources that can help us to navigate all of this. Because ultimately, in times of overwhelm like this, what people tend to do is they will start to let go of their own ability of sense making the world, and they just turn to 1 or 2 trusted experts, and that's fine. That makes a difference. We have the individuals that we go to learn about certain things, but we cannot do that at the expense of our own judgment. We cannot do that at the expense of our own perception. It's important that we develop our own skill set, our own abilities to truly critically think, to question everything, and to make sense of the world using our senses and all our faculties. So as I mentioned, there are a whole set of tools and practices that are available. And over the last couple of years, I've been studying a number of these different tools in order to help myself develop a better understanding of what's happening in the world, help myself to get a level of understand the level of complexity and uncertainty in the world in order to be able to do what we're doing here on the podcast. You know, over 500 episodes of the Pandemic podcast, scrutinizing everything. You know, the tagline was literally question everything. And I'm ever looking for the tools and practices that can help give me the edge. Now, the good news is, tonight, we have a special class happening inside the Elevate Network. We're doing a live sense-making class this evening, 8 p.m. UK time. We're joined by Alexander Beiner from Rebel Wisdom, who for the last couple of years have been running the Sense-Making 101 class. It's an 8-week program or a 7-week program. I took part in it several months ago. And it's a mind-blowing experience. And to me, it just radically opened my eyes about the world of different tools and practices that we can actually utilize on a daily basis to make sense of the world. Alexander's joining us tonight to take us through some of those practices live, immersively, in an online event on Zoom at 8 p.m. So our Elevate Network members have got all the details on that already, and hopefully they'll be joining us tonight. But if you're watching this now and you're not yet part of the network, or you haven't yet got a membership to what we're doing, every single month we're bringing different guests. We're bringing our podcast guests on. We're running live classes, and tonight it's no different. Tonight at 8 p.m. we have a sense-making class. So if you're not yet a member, you can get a free 30-day trial to be part of our group. It's danastingregory.com/upgrade. You can take part in all of our classes, therefore, this month, including our live in-person events. We had our first in Bristol earlier last week. So you can join us at danastingregory.com/upgrade, and you can get a 30-day free trial. Now, if for any reason you don't wish to become a member of the community that we are curating, you can also just go to danastingregory.com/sensemaking, grab a ticket for tonight's event. Now, why is this a paid event? Why isn't this free to all? Well, the simple answer to that is it costs us a lot of money to produce this podcast, run the network, all kinds of different software and tools. And we've been very grateful for the contributions of our members to help us to keep the lights on really effectively in terms of what we're doing. We're very transparent about how we use our cash. So you can join us as a free member. It'll cost you nothing. For the next 30 days, you can join us tonight, or you can grab a ticket for tonight. We also find that by putting a price on the events, people tend to value the experience more. You know, there's always free stuff available out there. We tend to undervalue things when they're free. So by placing a value on it, even a token value, we hopefully will give people the incentive to actually act upon what we share tonight. But of course, you know, Elevate is an organization that wants to make sure that no one has to miss out. So if anyone is unable to attend for any financial reasons, then just get in touch, respond to one of our emails, send us an email, hello@weareelevate.org, and we'll sort it all out. No one has to miss out on financial basis. But this is happening at 8 o'clock tonight. It's going to be a really practical session. Alexander's going to give us an overview of some of the tools that they use within the sense-making course. Of course, it's a course run by many different faculty members. But they'll give an overview tonight of what those tools are, and we're gonna put 2 or 3 of them into practice in the room. So if there's certain things that you're trying to make sense of right now, whether it's the energy crisis, whether it's the political changes, whether it's the situation in Ukraine, whether it's the Queen passing away, whether it's the King stepping into the throne, whatever it is that you're trying to make sense of right now, bring it with you to tonight's event, and you'll have the opportunity in small groups to actually explore some of those issues using some of these new tools in real time. So it's an exciting event. I hope you'll join us. It will be recorded if you can't make it live. So come and join us inside the Elevate Network. You'll see all the recordings in there. But this is a really important time to double down on our ability to make sense of the world. If you haven't checked out our episode with Alexander Beiner, Alexander was with us last week on the podcast. His episode is live on YouTube, on Apple, on Spotify. You can tune into that 90-minute conversation where we went into depth into some of these subjects as well. So I hope to see some of you tonight. The last thing, as I'll say, is this week I'm traveling to Austria to be part of the Better Way conference taking place in Vienna. I'll be doing loads of different footage, lots of different interviews whilst I'm there. I'm heading out on Thursday. I'll be there for the Friday Media Day, the whole event on the Saturday, and the Freedom March on Sunday. So watch out for live footage from all of those events. And I'm sure we'll be producing more content later this week. So watch this space. Hopefully you'll join us tonight. If you can't make it, don't worry, it'll be recorded. And I'll see you again later this week. Thanks for now. Peace and love.